Tonight, we're going to talk about the year the sky went wrong. The year the sun came up but didn't quite arrive. The year snow fell in June across New England. The year grain prices doubled from Dublin to Guangzhou. The year a group of bored aristocrats trapped indoors by endless rain accidentally invented the modern horror novel. And the year almost nobody on Earth understood that all of it, every last bit of it, was because of a mountain in Indonesia that had blown itself apart while they weren't looking. 1816. The year without a summer. And to understand how it happened, we've got to go back to April of 1815 and to a volcano called Tambora that most Europeans and Americans had never heard of, would never hear of in their lifetimes, and whose eruption would be, without exaggeration, the loudest event in the recorded history of the human species up to that point. Let's begin. But before we do, just a quick thank you to the people supporting the channel. We're a crowd-funded operation here. So if you're interested in that, links are in the pinned comment and description. We've got a Patreon, a donation link, a merch store, YouTube memberships, all of it. And if you can't do that, well, give us a like, a comment, hit that subscribe button. That pushes us out in the algorithm, and everybody's happy when they see that happen. All right, out of the way now. So let's really begin. The island of Sumbawa sits in the middle of what is now Indonesia, part of the Lesser Sunda island chain, a long spray of volcanic islands stretched east from Java toward Timor. In the early 19th century, it was part of the Dutch East Indies, though the Dutch presence was thin, mostly confined to coastal trading posts, and the interior was governed by local sultanates who had their own arrangements with the land and the sea. The island was fertile. It grew rice. It grew coffee. It exported horses, which were highly valued across the archipelago, and a species of aromatic hardwood that had made a few of the coastal traders quite wealthy. And rising out of the northern peninsula of Sumbawa, dominating the skyline for hundreds of miles in every direction, was Mount Tambora. It stood, before the events I'm about to describe, at roughly 4,300 meters. That's about 14,000 feet, or if you prefer, taller than any mountain in the continental United States east of the Rockies. It was one of the tallest peaks in the entire Indonesian archipelago. It was, in the memory of everyone alive at the time, a mountain. A big, sleepy, permanent mountain. It had shown some signs of restlessness in the years before 1815. There had been small tremors, a bit of steaming, some rumbling, but nothing that any of the local farmers found particularly alarming, and nothing that suggested to the geologists of the period, insofar as there were geologists of the period, we're talking pre-scientific era here for the most part, that anything catastrophic was on the horizon. On the 5th of April, 1815, the mountain began to rumble more seriously. A column of ash rose from the summit. There was a series of explosions loud enough to be heard on the neighboring islands, and the officials of the various coastal outposts in the region wrote in their logbooks that Tambora appeared to be having some kind of moderate eruption. That is what they thought was happening. A moderate eruption. Something newsworthy but manageable. Nothing that required serious concern. Well, they were about to be very, very wrong indeed. Because on the evening of the 10th of April, 5 days later, Tambora did not have a moderate eruption. Tambora detonated. Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles, who was at the time the British Lieutenant Governor of Java, roughly 1,000 miles away from Sumbawa, later collected accounts from officials, sea captains, and local witnesses across the region. And the picture that emerges from those accounts is one of an event whose scale genuinely defies the human capacity to describe. 3 columns of flame rose from the mountain, according to a witness on the island of Sumbawa itself, and merged into one great column at their peak, and the whole mountain appeared to be a body of liquid fire extending itself in every direction. The explosions that followed were heard in Sumatra, on the far end of Java, in Borneo, in the Moluccas. That's a radius of over 1,600 miles. 1,600 miles. To put that in perspective, that is the distance from London to Cairo. It is the distance from New York to Denver. The sound of a mountain exploding in Indonesia was heard, distinctly and unmistakably, at distances that in Europe would correspond to hearing an event in one capital city from another one, halfway across a continent. On multiple islands, British and Dutch officials mobilized troops in the belief that a sea battle was underway somewhere just over the horizon. They looked out over empty water for ships that were not there, for guns that had never fired, and they could not understand what they were hearing. The eruption itself lasted, in its most violent phase, for approximately 24 hours, and the numbers involved, which volcanologists have since worked out with painstaking care by studying the ash layers and the geological remnants, are, I think it's fair to say, difficult to hold in the mind. Tambora ejected approximately 150 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. That is enough rock, ash, and pulverized mountain to bury the entire island of Manhattan under a layer of debris more than 2 kilometers thick. The mountain itself lost the top 1,400 meters of its own height. It essentially blew its own summit off. The peak that had stood at over 4,000 meters was now, when the smoke cleared, standing at just under 3,000. A mile of mountain gone, vaporized, blasted outward, carried away in the eruption column. The explosive force was later estimated on the Volcanic Explosivity Index at a 7 out of 8. That makes it the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history. Bigger than Krakatoa in 1883, which people tend to remember. Bigger than Vesuvius in 79 AD. Bigger than Mount St. Helens. Bigger than Pinatubo. Bigger than anything the modern world has directly witnessed. And it happened, in an important sense, off stage, because the world was busy. You've got to remember what April 1815 looked like in the places that ran the world's newspapers. Napoleon Bonaparte had escaped from Elba in February of that year, had marched on Paris, had reclaimed the throne of France, and had begun assembling an army to fight what would become the 100 Days Campaign. All of Europe was on the brink of war. The Congress of Vienna was in the middle of renegotiating the entire political map of the continent. Every diplomatic dispatch, every newspaper column, every letter home was full of Napoleon, of Wellington, of the Prussian mobilization, of what the Austrians were going to do, of what the Russians were going to do. And on the 18th of June, 1815, 10 weeks after Tambora had erupted, the Battle of Waterloo was fought. Napoleon was defeated for the last time, and the European press had, effectively, no room for anything else. The eruption of a mountain in the Dutch East Indies, on an island most Europeans could not have found on a map, received only the briefest of mentions in a handful of maritime publications. A curiosity from the East Indies, a minor calamity in a faraway place. Not really news, but of course it was news. It was, in fact, some of the most consequential news of the entire century, and the people writing the newspapers simply had no way of knowing that yet. Because a volcanic eruption of that magnitude does not just kill people locally, though it certainly does that. The immediate death toll on Sumbawa and the surrounding islands was catastrophic. Pyroclastic flows, superheated avalanches of gas and ash moving at hundreds of miles an hour, incinerated everything in their path along the flanks of the mountain. The entire kingdom of Tambora, the local sultanate that had given the mountain its name, was wiped from existence. Every town, every village, every field, every person, gone in a matter of hours. Tsunamis triggered by the collapse of the mountain and by the ash falling into the sea struck the coasts of neighboring islands and killed thousands more. Ash fell so heavily on Sumbawa and eastern Lombok that the weight of it collapsed the roofs of houses, even in villages that had escaped the initial blast. And in the weeks and months that followed, famine and disease finished what the eruption had begun. Crops were buried, livestock was suffocated, drinking water was fouled, and the population of the region collapsed. The best modern estimates suggest that between 70,000 and 100,000 people died from the eruption and its immediate aftermath in Indonesia alone. Some estimates run higher. The sources are honestly quite thin on this, given that the region was one whose demographic records were, in 1815, essentially not being kept, and the survivors had rather more pressing concerns than census work. But the number, whatever its precise value, represents one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history. And Europe did not notice. What Europe did do, though it did not understand this, was what it was doing, was inhale. Because the eruption had not simply thrown ash into the local sky. It had thrown material, and specifically an enormous quantity of sulfur dioxide gas, all the way up into the stratosphere. Somewhere between 55 and 60 million tons of sulfur dioxide, according to modern estimates derived from ice core samples in Greenland and Antarctica. The stratosphere, unlike the lower atmosphere, is a place where things do not simply rain out or blow down within a few days. It is a place where a stable veil of aerosol droplets, in this case droplets of sulfuric acid formed by the reaction of sulfur dioxide with water vapor at altitude, can persist for years. And these droplets do a particular thing. They reflect sunlight. They act like a mirror wrapped around the whole planet, sending a small but meaningful fraction of the sun's energy back out into space before it can reach the ground. And by the summer of 1815, the winds of the upper atmosphere were already carrying that veil around the world. It moved east across the Pacific. It crossed North America. It crossed the Atlantic. It settled itself over Europe, and nobody could see it, but they were about to feel it. Because in the winter of 1815 and into the spring of 1816, the sun was going to start looking, to farmers and sailors and painters and hungry crowds all over the northern hemisphere, just a little bit wrong. The first signs that something was wrong with the sky came, oddly enough, not from farmers or sailors or scientists, but from painters. Which is a strange thing to say, I know, but bear with me on this one, because it makes a certain amount of sense when you think it through. Painters are trained observers of light. That is, in a fundamental sense, what a landscape painter actually does for a living. They spend their working hours looking at the sky, at the way sunlight falls on water, at the specific quality of the light at dawn and at dusk, and they notice, more quickly than almost anyone else, when that quality changes. And across the summer and autumn of 1815, and then throughout 1816 and into 1817, and even 1818, the painters of Northern Europe were noticing something extraordinary. The sunsets had gone strange. They had gone red. Not the ordinary red of a warm evening, but a deep, saturated, almost lurid red that painters had never seen before, and that would not be seen again with such consistency until well into the following century. Joseph Mallord William Turner, the English landscape painter whose reputation was, by 1815, already well established, began producing across these years a series of skis that his critics found startling, even unbelievable. Canvases in which the setting sun appeared as an enormous blood-orange disk suspended in a sky of vermilion and gold, with clouds streaked in colors that seemed to bear no relation to any actual sky anyone had actually seen. Turner was accused, by some of his contemporaries, of exaggerating, of inventing skis that could not exist, of substituting artistic license for accurate observation. And Turner, who had a somewhat contrarian streak, essentially told his critics to look up and see for themselves, because he had not invented anything. He was painting what he was actually seeing. Modern researchers, most notably a team led by the atmospheric physicist Christos Zarifos, have gone back through the paintings of the period and analyzed the specific ratios of red to green in the depicted skis, and they have shown that Turner's sunsets, and those of a number of other painters working across the same years, correspond precisely to what modern atmospheric science predicts a sky ought to look like when the stratosphere is loaded with volcanic aerosols. The painters were, without knowing it, functioning as data recorders for an event whose meteorological signature would not be understood for another century and a half. Caspar David Friedrich, working in Germany, produced across the same years his most famous and most eerily luminous canvases, including works whose skis have that same otherworldly quality that Turner was capturing in England. And even in America, where the artistic tradition was younger and less developed, painters of the Hudson River School who were just beginning to establish their careers noted in their letters and journals that the light across the summers of 1816 and 1817 had a quality they struggled to describe. Something cold in it, something distant. The sun had, in an important sense, gone a little bit strange, and everyone who spent their working life looking at it had noticed. But nobody, and this is the crucial point, nobody knew why. The connection between the strange skis of Northern Europe and the mountain that had blown itself apart on the other side of the world was, for the people living through it, entirely invisible. It would remain invisible for a very long time. Because in 1815 and 1816, atmospheric science, if we can even call it that, simply did not possess the concepts that would have allowed anyone to make that connection. The idea that a volcanic eruption could throw material high enough into the atmosphere to affect global climate was not something that appeared in the scientific literature. It was not something anyone had proposed. It would not be proposed in any serious form until Benjamin Franklin had made some preliminary speculations about the Icelandic Laki eruption of 1783, and even those speculations had been mostly ignored. So the world watched the sunsets, and the world painted the sunsets, and the world did not know what it was seeing. Then came the winter. The winter of 1815 into 1816 was, across much of Europe and North America, cold. Not catastrophically cold. Winters were cold in that period as a rule. The Little Ice Age was still in effect, and cold winters were part of the ordinary rhythm of life across the northern latitudes. But there was something a bit off about this winter. It lingered. It refused to break in the way that winters were supposed to break. And when spring came, or when spring was supposed to come, it didn't quite arrive. Across the North Atlantic, from Ireland to Norway to New England, the temperatures in March and April of 1816 were significantly below what the local populations had come to expect. Farmers who ought to have been preparing their fields for planting found the ground still frozen well into what should have been the growing season. Rivers that had thawed by early March in ordinary years remained iced over into April. There were reports from Scotland of ice on the lochs into May, and the sun, when it appeared at all, appeared through a haze that gave it a peculiar quality. Muted, weakened. A witness in England wrote in a letter that spring that the sun at noon appeared as it ordinarily did at 4 in the afternoon, and that he could look at it directly without discomfort. That last detail is important, because a sun that you can look at directly at midday is not a healthy sun. It is a sun whose light is being filtered by something in the upper atmosphere, and if you can see that filter with your naked eye, that filter is quite thick indeed. But even now, as the growing season failed to begin and the cold refused to lift, most people simply understood what was happening as a bad spring. A late spring. An unusually harsh continuation of winter. These things happened. The historical memory of Northern Europe was full of bad springs and lost harvests, and the assumption in most communities was that the weather would eventually correct itself. Except this time it wasn't going to, because May came, and May was cold, and then June came, and June, across enormous portions of the Northern Hemisphere, was the moment when people finally understood that something was genuinely, catastrophically, historically wrong. On the 6th of June, 1816, snow fell across New England. Not flurries, not a dusting. Real, accumulating snow. In some parts of Vermont and New Hampshire up to a foot of it. In parts of Quebec, considerably more. Farmers who had planted their spring wheat and their corn watched the snow bury their newly emerged crops. Sheep that had been shorn for the summer, because shearing in early June was standard practice, died in the fields by the hundreds. The temperature in Albany, New York, on the morning of the 8th of June, was recorded at just above freezing. In Waltham, Massachusetts, a farmer named Benjamin Harwood wrote in his diary that morning that the ground was frozen hard and that ice had formed on the water buckets outside the barn. In Maine, snow drifts of over 2 feet were reported in the highlands, and across the whole of New England, the population responded with a mixture of disbelief, alarm, and grim humor. The name that farmers began to give to the year, and which would stick to it in the folk memory of the region for generations afterwards, was 1800 and froze to death. Some communities preferred a different name, the poverty year, the year there was no summer. In parts of Vermont, they simply called it 1816, and the tone in which they said it told you everything you needed to know. A farmer in New Hampshire, whose name comes down to us as Joseph, and whose account was preserved in a local historical record, wrote to his brother in the middle of June of that year that he had planted corn 3 times, and 3 times the frost had killed it. And he did not know what he was going to do about the coming winter, because if the corn did not grow, he would have nothing to feed his family and nothing to feed his livestock, and no way to buy either because everyone else in the county was in exactly the same position. That letter, whose full text has been reproduced in various histories of the period, has the particular quality of desperation held in check by practical necessity that you find in the writing of people who cannot afford to fall apart because there is too much work to do. Joseph did not fall apart. He kept planting. He kept trying. But he was, by the middle of that summer, watching his livelihood dissolve in front of him, and he had no idea why. Because that was the peculiar horror of it. Nobody knew why. The weather in the summer of 1816 was not just cold. It was chaotic. There were periodic warm days in July that would raise hopes that the season had finally turned, followed by killing frosts a week later that would destroy whatever had begun to grow during the warm interval. There were extraordinary storms. There was persistent rain. In parts of Europe, particularly around the Alps, it rained essentially continuously from May through August, and the resulting floods destroyed crops in regions that had escaped the frost. In Ireland, the rain fell for 142 days out of the summer, a figure that was recorded at the time and has been verified in subsequent meteorological reconstructions. The potato crop in Ireland, upon which a huge proportion of the rural population depended for basic survival, failed comprehensively. In China, the monsoon patterns were disrupted, and rice harvests across Yunnan and the surrounding provinces collapsed. In India, the summer monsoon arrived late and behaved oddly, and there is a body of research suggesting that the cholera pandemic that began in Bengal in 1817, and which would eventually kill millions of people across the world in successive waves throughout the 19th century, was directly triggered by the disruption of the Ganges Delta ecology by the abnormal weather of the previous year. The year without a summer was, in this sense, not just a European or an American event. It was a genuinely global catastrophe. It just happened to be a catastrophe whose central cause was located on an island that the people suffering its consequences had never heard of, whose eruption they did not know about, and whose connection to their own lives they had no framework to understand. They were living through the aftermath of a mountain, and they did not know it. They only knew that the sky was wrong, the sun was weak, and the crops were dying. By the time the failed harvest of 1816 was in, or rather when it became clear to everyone concerned that there was not going to be a harvest to speak of, the second phase of the catastrophe began. And this phase was, in many respects, the more visible one, the one that historians and journalists at the time actually did notice, even if they did not connect it to the strange weather and would certainly never have connected it to a volcano halfway around the world. This was the phase of hunger. And hunger, in a pre-industrial economy whose grain markets were only loosely integrated across regions and whose transportation networks were slow and expensive, moves very quickly indeed from being a local problem to being a political one. Grain prices across Europe began to climb in the autumn of 1816 and continued climbing throughout 1817. In some regions, the price of wheat doubled. In some, it tripled. In Switzerland, in parts of southern Germany, in eastern France, in the areas of northern Italy that had been most heavily affected by the incessant rain, the increase was even sharper than that. And when grain prices double or triple in an economy where a substantial portion of the working population spends more than half of its income on bread already, what you have is not simply an inconvenience. What you have is a subsistence crisis. What you have is people beginning to genuinely starve. The reports that came in through the autumn and winter of 1816 and into 1817 have the specific dreadful quality that reports of famine always have. Communities eating the seed grain they had set aside for the next year's planting, because the alternative was to eat nothing at all. Families slaughtering livestock they could not feed, and in doing so destroying the productive base they would need to rebuild afterwards. The traditional foods of last resort came back into the diet across enormous regions. Bark bread, made by grinding the inner bark of certain trees and mixing it with whatever flour was available. Nettle soup, roots dug from the frozen ground. Grasses. In the alpine regions of Switzerland, The diaries and parish records from the period describe scenes that would not have been out of place in a medieval account of a bad plague year. People too weak to work, children too weak to cry, whole villages where the population dropped by 20 or 30% over the course of a single winter, not from any single dramatic event, but from the slow, grinding effects of malnutrition compounded by the diseases that malnutrition invites in. Typhus began to spread through parts of Ireland and Britain in 1817 and 1818, following the classic pattern of a population weakened by hunger and displaced from its ordinary living arrangements. The death toll from that typhus outbreak alone, across the British Isles, has been estimated in the range of 65,000 people. The total death toll from the year without a summer, if you include the famine deaths, the disease deaths that followed, and the cholera pandemic that was triggered in its aftermath, runs into the hundreds of thousands at minimum and possibly, depending on how you count the Asian mortality, into the millions. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes of the entire 19th century. And it happened, once again, without anyone understanding what had caused it. What happened instead, and this is the part that gets truly interesting for anyone who studies the politics of hunger, was that the population began to look for someone to blame. Because if you are starving and your children are starving, and you do not have the intellectual framework to blame a distant volcano, you are going to blame someone closer to hand. And in the winter of 1816 and the spring of 1817, across enormous swathes of Europe, hungry crowds took to the streets, and the target of their anger was, almost universally, the people who were perceived to be hoarding grain, profiteering from the shortage, or otherwise benefiting from a crisis that was destroying everyone else. The bread riots of that period were not random outbreaks of desperation. They followed a recognizable, and in some sense, morally coherent pattern. Crowds would gather outside the granaries of grain merchants who were suspected of holding back stocks in order to drive prices higher. They would gather outside the mills of millers who were charging what were seen as unjust prices for grinding. They would gather outside the bakeries of bakers who had raised the price of a loaf beyond what the local population considered legitimate. And in a great many cases, they would take direct action. Grain stores were broken into, mills were attacked, bakeries were emptied. In some incidents, the crowd would seize the grain, sell it at what they considered a fair price, and turn the proceeds over to the merchant, which is a fascinating detail because it suggests that these were not simple lootings. They were, in the language of the historian E.P. Thompson, who studied this kind of crowd action in considerable depth, a form of moral economy. The crowd was enforcing what it believed to be the correct price. They were not stealing. They were, in their own understanding, correcting a market that had gone wrong. The largest of these disturbances in continental Europe took place across parts of what would later become Germany, in the Rhineland, and in Bavaria, and in eastern France. In England, there were significant riots in East Anglia, in the town of Ely, and in the surrounding Fenland communities, where in May of 1816 crowds carrying banners with slogans demanding bread or blood marched through the streets, broke into shops, and threatened the local magistrates. The Ely and Littleport riots, as they came to be known, were serious enough that the government sent in troops, and 5 of the participants were eventually hanged, an outcome that reflects the degree to which the authorities across Europe were terrified by what these disturbances might become. Because you have to remember, the ruling classes of Europe in 1816 and 1817 had extremely fresh memories of the French Revolution. Fresh memories of what happens when hungry crowds get organized. Fresh memories of the guillotine. And the possibility that food riots might escalate into something more comprehensive, into a general revolutionary movement, was one that occupied a great deal of official correspondence throughout this period. The letters and reports of British Home Office officials from the years 1816 through 1818 are full of anxious assessments of the possibility that the country was on the brink of a revolutionary situation. Similar anxieties dominated the correspondence of the Austrian, Prussian, and Russian governments. The great powers of Europe, having just spent 20 years fighting revolutionary and Napoleonic France, were watching their own populations with a nervousness that was, in retrospect, not entirely unjustified. Nothing on the scale of a revolution actually materialized in the immediate crisis, though the disturbances of these years did contribute to a general political instability that would flare up again and again over the following decades. But what did materialize, and what is arguably one of the most significant demographic consequences of the year without a summer, was migration. Because when your farm has failed, and your community has failed, and your government cannot help you and you do not know when, if ever, the weather is going to return to normal, one option that begins to look increasingly attractive is simply to leave. And across 1816 and 1817, the number of Europeans deciding to leave increased dramatically. Immigration into the United States, which had been running at a fairly modest level in the years immediately following the Napoleonic Wars, suddenly surged. Ships arriving in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston across these years were carrying passengers whose stories, when interviewers bothered to record them, described the same set of experiences over and over again. Failed harvests, rising grain prices, communities where there was nothing left. Something had to give and something had to change, and America was where they were going. In New England itself, the failed harvests of 1816 and the widespread perception that the northeastern climate had somehow, permanently, turned against agriculture triggered one of the largest internal migrations in early American history. Farmers from Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, having lost their harvests and unable to see any future in continuing to farm the stony soils of the region, packed up their families and headed west. Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. The great westward migration of the American population, which was already underway before 1816, but which accelerated dramatically in the years immediately following it, was substantially driven by the belief among New England farmers that the climate of their ancestral region had turned against them, and that better land, warmer weather, and more reliable seasons awaited them somewhere over the mountains. The population of Vermont actually declined between 1810 and 1820, one of the very few periods in American history when a state's population has actually shrunk in an absolute sense during a decade of general national growth. And the decline was concentrated in exactly the years following the year without a summer. This was people voting with their feet against a climate they no longer trusted. The irony, of course, and it is an irony worth pausing on, is that the climate had not turned against them at all. The climate was, in the strict sense, exactly where it had been before 1815, and would return to something very close to that baseline by the end of the decade, once the volcanic aerosols had settled out of the stratosphere and the sun had regained its full strength. But the New England farmers of 1816 had no way of knowing that. They had no way of knowing that what they were experiencing was a temporary event, a 2 or 3 year anomaly caused by a volcano they had never heard of. What they knew was what they saw. Their crops had failed. Their livestock had died. The soil that had fed their families for generations had in a single terrifying year apparently ceased to function. And so they left. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands of them. And the geography of American settlement was permanently reshaped by their departure. The demographic weight of the country tilted westward at a pace that would probably have happened eventually in any case, but which happened specifically in the years 1816 through 1820 at a rate that was directly attributable to the atmospheric consequences of a mountain that had blown itself apart in Indonesia in April of 1815. The year without a summer, in this sense, was not just a story about weather and hunger and fear. It was a story about a permanent redirection of human populations across an entire continent. It moved people, and the people once moved did not come back. But we are getting slightly ahead of ourselves, because before the migration and before the westward flight, something else happened in the summer of 1816. Something small in the great scheme of things, something local. A group of writers, trapped in a rented villa on the shore of Lake Geneva by the relentless rain, decided to entertain themselves. And in that villa, across the course of a single wet, cold, miserable summer, two of the most enduring monsters in the history of Western literature were quietly and almost accidentally brought into the world. The Villa Diodati sits on a slope above the southern shore of Lake Geneva, just outside the town of Cologne, looking out across the water toward the city of Geneva itself, and on a clear day toward the mountains of the Jura beyond. In the summer of 1816, however, there were very few clear days. The villa had been rented for the season by a young English poet who had left England in something of a hurry that spring, under the general cloud of a scandal that had made his continued residence in London socially impossible. His name was George Gordon, Lord Byron, and by the summer of 1816, he was, at the age of 28, quite possibly the most famous living writer in the English language, and quite certainly the most notorious. His marriage had collapsed under conditions that his estranged wife had allowed to become public in ways that suggested that Byron's private life had contained elements the public was not equipped to forgive. There were rumors of an affair with his half-sister. There were rumors of considerably worse. And Byron, whose relationship to public opinion had always been ambivalent, had decided that a European tour was the appropriate response to a situation that was no longer manageable at home. He had traveled through Belgium, had visited the site of the Waterloo battlefield the previous year while it was still fresh, and had made his way south through Germany and Switzerland, accompanied by a young personal physician named John William Polidori. Polidori was 20 years old, an ambitious and rather touchy young man who had recently completed his medical degree at Edinburgh, and who had been engaged partly as Byron's doctor and partly, one suspects, as a companion who could serve as an audience for Byron's ongoing performance of Byronicness. The relationship between the two of them was, from all accounts, complicated. Polidori admired Byron intensely and resented him equally intensely, in that specific proportion that ambitious young men tend to feel about the older, more famous figures whose orbit they have entered and whose light they cannot help standing in. And when they arrived at the Villa Diodati in late May of 1816, they found that another party of English literary tourists had taken a smaller house nearby, a place called Mason Chapuis, just down the slope by the lake shore. The party consisted of Percy Bysshe Shelley, a poet of considerable reputation in progressive intellectual circles, though nowhere near the fame that Byron commanded, his 18-year-old lover Mary Godwin, and Mary's stepsister Claire Claremont, who was, by that point in the summer, secretly pregnant with Byron's child. It's worth pausing on this cast, because the density of literary and personal complication is almost comic. You have Byron, exiled from England under a cloud, staying in the villa. You have Shelley, who had abandoned his first wife and children to run away with the 16-year-old Mary Godwin 2 years earlier, staying at the smaller house. You have Mary, who was the daughter of the pioneering feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, dead in childbirth days after Mary's own birth, and of William Godwin, the political philosopher whose ideas about anarchism and rational governance had shaped a generation of English radicals. You have Claire, who had essentially engineered her way into Byron's bed in London some months earlier, and had followed him to Switzerland in the hopes of continuing the affair, whether Byron wanted her there or not. You have Polidori, watching all of this and taking notes with a mixture of fascination and jealousy. And you have, hanging over all of it, the weather. Because the weather was the reason this group ended up spending so much time together indoors. In an ordinary Swiss summer, the party would have spent its days boating on the lake, hiking in the surrounding hills, taking excursions to view the alpine scenery that was, by 1816, one of the established attractions of the European Grand Tour. That was, in fact, what they had planned to do. But the summer of 1816 was, in Switzerland as in New England, catastrophically wrong. The rain fell continuously. The lake was covered in fog. The mountains disappeared for weeks at a time behind curtains of low cloud. The temperatures were more appropriate to autumn than to summer, and the party of English tourists, unable to do any of the outdoor things they had come to Switzerland to do, found themselves confined to the villa evening after evening, day after day, watching the rain hit the windows and trying to find ways to entertain themselves. Mary Shelley, writing years later in the introduction to a new edition of the novel that would eventually emerge from that summer, described the weather in terms that make quite clear how oppressive it had become. It proved, she wrote, a wet, ungenial summer and incessant rain often confined us for days to the house. The evenings at the Villa Diodati, in the account that we have of them from various participants and from Mary's later reconstruction, seem to have developed a particular character. Byron, always the theatrical centre of any room he was in, presided. There was a great deal of conversation, some of it on serious literary and philosophical topics, some of it on the recent events in European politics, some of it on the personal complications that were unfolding within the party itself. There was wine. There was, if certain accounts are to be believed, a considerable amount of laudanum, which is a tincture of opium in alcohol that was, at the time, freely available and widely used by literary types for its supposed effects on the imagination. There were readings. And on one particular evening in the middle of June, an evening whose specific date Mary later placed as around the 16th of the month, the group turned to a volume of German ghost stories that Byron had picked up somewhere on their travels. The book was a French translation of a German collection called the Phantasmagoriana, and it contained the kind of atmospheric horror tales that were fashionable in the German romantic literature of the period. Stories of haunted castles, stories of spectral apparitions, stories of dead lovers returning to visit the living. The group read these stories aloud to each other by candlelight while the rain hammered against the windows of the villa. And then, at some point in the course of that evening, Byron made a proposal. Each of them, he said, should write a ghost story of their own. The proposal was made, one imagines, in the spirit of an after-dinner amusement, a parlor game. Something to fill the empty hours of the miserable summer. But the proposal turned out, in the event, to be one of the most consequential after-dinner amusements in the entire history of literature. Because when the members of the group actually sat down to try to write their ghost stories, in the days and weeks that followed, two of them found that the game had, quite unexpectedly, produced something more than they had bargained for. Byron himself began a story, a fragment about a mysterious traveller who dies under obscure circumstances in a foreign country and whose companion is bound by an oath not to reveal the circumstances of his death. He got a few pages into it, and then, in the manner that was quite characteristic of Byron, abandoned it and turned his attention to other things. Shelley began something and quickly gave it up. Claire Claremont, if she attempted anything at all, produced nothing that has survived. But two members of the party did not abandon their attempts. Two of them, working in the shadow of that miserable summer and drawing on the atmosphere of extended enforced confinement that the weather had imposed, produced works that would fundamentally reshape the literature of the supernatural for the following 2 centuries. The first of these was Mary Godwin, who would in a few months become Mary Shelley when Percy's first wife committed suicide and left him free to marry his young mistress. Mary was, at the time of the Ghost Story Challenge, 18 years old. She had grown up in one of the most intellectually intense households in England. Her father, William Godwin, had raised her on a diet of political philosophy, radical politics, and the assumption that a young woman of her background was expected to think as seriously about serious things as any man. She had eloped with Percy Shelley at the age of 16. She had already lost one child in infancy, a daughter who had been born prematurely in early 1815 and had lived only a few days. She had given birth to a second child, William, in January of 1816, who was with the party at the villa. And she was, in the summer of 1816, a young woman whose experience of death, of birth, of motherhood, of love, and of the philosophical questions about the origins and meaning of human life was, at 18, considerably more developed than that of most women or men 3 times her age. When Byron proposed the Ghost Story Challenge, Mary tried to write something and, by her own account, could not think of anything. Night after night, she said, she tried to find her story, and night after night, nothing came. She would sit and listen to the conversations of the men, particularly the conversations between Byron and Percy Shelley, who were increasingly turning, across those long rainy evenings, to speculations about the nature of life itself. About the possibility, then being investigated in serious scientific quarters, that the animating principle of living organisms might be some form of electricity. About the experiments of Luigi Galvani, who had, some decades earlier, demonstrated that dead frogs' legs could be made to twitch by the application of electrical current. About the experiments of Galvani's nephew Giovanni Aldini, who had, in London in 1803, applied a galvanic battery to the corpse of a hanged murderer named George Forster and produced spasms of the dead man's limbs, the opening of one dead eye, and movements of the jaw that had genuinely convinced some of the observers that they were watching a man being brought back from the dead. Mary listened to these conversations. And on one particular night, which she later described in detail, having gone to bed after a long evening of exactly this kind of talk, she found that she could not sleep, and that in the strange half-conscious state between waking and sleeping, an image came to her. She saw, with a clarity that unsettled her, a pale student of the unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. She saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. She saw the student flee from his creation in horror, and she saw the thing, this newly animated thing, standing beside the student's bed in the dark, opening its eyes, watching him. What Mary Godwin had seen in a half-waking vision at the Villa Diodati was, in a sense that she did not quite yet understand, the future of Western horror. She began writing the following morning, the story that emerged in the days and weeks that followed, and that would eventually be expanded and completed over the next year and a half, and published anonymously in London in January of 1818, was Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. And it is worth pausing on the specific character of what Mary Shelley had actually produced, because Frankenstein is a novel whose cultural presence is, by this point, so enormous and so distorted by 2 centuries of adaptation, imitation, and misunderstanding that most people who think they know the story do not, in fact, know the story at all. The bolt of lightning striking the tower, the shambling green-skinned monster with bolts in his neck, the deranged laughter of the mad scientist, the villagers with pitchforks and torches, none of that is in the novel. That is Hollywood. That is the Universal Studios adaptation of 1931. What Mary Shelley actually wrote is something considerably stranger and considerably more disturbing than the cultural memory of Frankenstein has retained. What she wrote is the story of a young Swiss student named Victor Frankenstein, brilliant, ambitious, and psychologically ill-equipped for what he is about to do, who becomes obsessed with the question of the origins of life, and who, working in secret in his rooms at the University of Ingolstadt, discovers a means of animating dead matter. The novel is very deliberately vague about the specific mechanism. Mary Shelley knew that specificity in these things is fatal to the imagination, and she keeps the actual process of animation off stage, described in retrospect by Victor in terms that emphasize his horror at what he has done rather than the technical details of how he did it. But he does it. He assembles a body from parts collected from charnel houses and dissecting rooms, and he brings it to life. And then, in the moment of his success, he looks at what he has created, and he is overwhelmed by revulsion. The creature, whom he never names, and who is referred to throughout the novel simply as the creature, the demon, the wretch, the being, this creature opens his eyes, and Victor Frankenstein looks at him and flees. He runs out of his rooms. He wanders the streets of Ingolstadt in a state of psychological collapse, and he refuses, from that moment onward, to acknowledge the existence of the thing he has made. The creature, left alone in Victor's rooms without instruction, without care, without a name, and without any understanding of what he is or where he has come from, wanders out into the world by himself. And the rest of the novel is the story of what happens to a conscious, intelligent, articulate being who has been brought into existence and then immediately abandoned by his creator. That is what Mary Shelley wrote in the summer of 1816. Not a story about a monster. A story about a father who refused to be a father. A story about the moral obligations we incur by creating something and the catastrophes that follow when we refuse to acknowledge those obligations. The creature in Mary Shelley's novel is not stupid, is not incoherent, is not a shuffling animalistic thing. He is, in fact, one of the most articulate characters in the entire book. He teaches himself to speak by listening to family through a hole in the wall of a hovel adjoining their cottage. He teaches himself to read by studying discarded books. He reads Milton's Paradise Lost and understands himself, quite pointedly, as a version of Adam who has been abandoned by his God. He reads Goethe, he reads Plutarch, and he seeks out Victor Frankenstein, not for revenge in the first instance, but to demand from his maker the one thing he actually needs, which is a companion, a mate, another being like himself who can meet him in the world on equal terms. Victor refuses, and the tragedy of the novel unfolds from that refusal. This is not, and I cannot emphasize this enough, a horror story in the ordinary sense. It is a philosophical parable about the ethics of creation, dressed in the atmospheric costume of the Gothic novel. And it is, I think, quite genuinely astonishing that it was written by an 18-year-old woman across the course of a rainy Swiss summer in the wake of a volcanic eruption that had, without anyone at the villa knowing it, plunged Europe into darkness and cold. The specific atmospheric conditions of that summer bleed into the novel in ways that repay attention. The action moves through landscapes of ice and glacier and mountain, landscapes of the kind that Mary and Percy had actually traveled through on their way to Switzerland, and that were, in 1816, unusually savage, even by Alpine standards, because of the abnormal weather. Some of the most famous scenes in the novel, including the confrontation between Victor and his creature on the Mer de Glace, the great glacier above Chamonix, take place in landscapes whose cold and desolation is not incidental scenery, but is thematically central to what the book is doing. The creature, unnamed and unloved, is repeatedly associated with polar regions, with ice, with the extremes of the natural world at its most inhospitable. The novel begins and ends with a framing narrative set on a ship trying to reach the North Pole, trapped in the polar ice, in a landscape whose cold has a fictive extremity that would have felt, to readers in 1818 and 1819, more plausible than it would have felt in any other decade, because those readers had recently lived through summers when snow had fallen in June and ice had formed on ponds in July. Frankenstein is a novel written by candlelight in a cold house during a cold summer, and its imaginative world is the imaginative world of a climate that was, without anyone quite understanding why, going wrong. The volcanic eruption was in the book without ever being named in it. The atmosphere of Tambora had reached the Villa Diodati and had, in a fashion, made its way onto the page. And Mary Shelley was not the only writer in that villa who was producing something extraordinary in the shadow of that atmosphere. Because John Polidori, the 20-year-old physician whose relationship with Byron had been curdling steadily across the summer, was also working on something. And what Polidori was working on, though it would take him years to develop it into its final form, and though its publication would eventually be entangled in one of the more sordid literary disputes of the 19th century, was the modern vampire. Byron had, in his fragment that he abandoned after a few pages, sketched out the outlines of a story about a mysterious, aristocratic English traveller named Augustus Darvel who dies under obscure circumstances in Greece and whose death is bound by an oath of secrecy. It is a story fragment. It goes nowhere. Byron himself lost interest in it and moved on. But Polidori, who had been present when Byron read the fragment aloud, and who had listened to the conversations from which it emerged, took the seed of the idea, and over the following 2 or 3 years developed it into a novella that he called simply The Vampire. And the vampire that Polidori created was a very specific and very consequential kind of character. Because before Polidori, the vampire in European folklore had been something quite different from what we now think of when we use the word. The traditional vampire of the folk traditions of the Balkans and Central and Eastern Europe was a peasant creature, a revenant. Typically, someone who had died under improper circumstances, an unbaptized child, a suicide, a person who had died under curse, whose body did not decompose properly in the grave, and who rose at night to return to the village and drink the blood of relatives or neighbors. The traditional vampire was rural. He was ugly. He was bloated and purple in some accounts from the blood he had consumed. He was, essentially, a walking corpse. He was not sexy. He was not sophisticated. He was not aristocratic. He was a folk horror. What Polidori did in The Vampire, and this is his real contribution to the history of the horror genre, was to take this rural folk creature and transplant him into the salons of Regency-era high society. Polidori's vampire, whom he named Lord Ruthven, is not a peasant revenant. He is an aristocrat. He moves through the parties and gambling halls of London and the resorts of continental Europe. He is charming, cultivated, sexually magnetic, and completely amoral. He seduces young women and destroys them. He gambles. He dresses well. He is, and this is the crucial point, based rather obviously and rather maliciously on Lord Byron himself. Polidori, who by the time he wrote the novella had fallen out with Byron thoroughly and had been dismissed from his employment, essentially wrote his old employer into the character of a bloodsucking, undead nobleman preying on innocent English virgins. It was a piece of literary revenge dressed as a horror story, and it inaugurated a subgenre. The vampire, from Polidori onwards, would be an aristocrat. The vampire would be seductive rather than repulsive. The vampire would be a figure whose horror was bound up with sexual danger and social class, as much as with any straightforward violence. Every subsequent development in vampire fiction, from Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla in 1872, through Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1897, through the vast 20th century tradition of vampire novels and films that runs from Bela Lugosi through Anne Rice through Twilight and beyond, is descended from Polidori's Lord Ruthven. And Lord Ruthven was born in the same rainy villa on Lake Geneva as Frankenstein's creature, in the same summer. Under the same strange sky, the Villa Diodati summer produced, in the space of a few weeks, the two dominant myths that Western horror would spend the next 2 centuries elaborating. The scientific horror, the story of what happens when we create life we cannot control, and the sexual horror, the story of the seductive predator who moves invisibly through polite society. Everything else, in a sense, is footnotes to these two texts. And both of them were the products of a bored, damp, cold, confined party of English literary tourists sheltering from a summer that had been broken by a volcano they had never heard of. The publication history of The Vampire would end up being tangled and unhappy. When it was finally published, in a London literary magazine in April of 1819, it was published under Byron's name rather than Polidori's, either through a genuine mistake by the editor or through a deliberate decision to attribute a marketable story to the more famous author. Byron was furious. He denied authorship and attempted to publicize his fragment of the original tale as evidence that he had not written the novella. Polidori was furious. He had produced the finished work, he had shaped the character, and he was watching the credit for his own creation being assigned to the man whose behavior toward him had partly inspired the story. And Polidori himself, who was, by all accounts, an unstable young man whose life had been drifting in unfortunate directions ever since he had left Byron's employment, would die in August of 1821 at the age of 25, apparently by suicide, having lost significant sums at gambling and having failed to establish himself in any of the professional directions he had attempted. The vampire had outlived his creator by a considerable margin. He would, in a sense, outlive all of them. While Mary Shelley was writing her novel of scientific horror and John Polidori was drafting his aristocratic vampire in the damp villa on Lake Geneva, and while farmers from Vermont to Bavaria were watching their crops die in fields that would not warm, another consequence of the volcanic summer was quietly unfolding in a small workshop in the Grand Duchy of Baden, in the southwest of what would later become Germany. And this consequence, unlike the literary ones, would leave a physical object in the world that still exists today in various evolved forms, and that most of us have ridden at some point in our lives. Because the year without a summer, through a chain of causation that is genuinely one of the strangest in the history of technology, invented the bicycle. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what horses were in the economy of early 19th century Europe. Horses were, in an important sense, the entire transportation infrastructure. They pulled carts and carriages. They carried mail and messages. They moved agricultural produce from farm to market. They pulled the plows that turned the fields. They hauled the timber out of the forests. They dragged the barges along the canals where the canals had been dug, and they carried individual riders from town to town along the roads where the roads existed. A pre-industrial European economy without horses is essentially not a functioning economy at all. It is a landscape of isolated communities unable to exchange goods with each other at any scale. The horse was, in a way that is very difficult for us to imagine now, the fundamental technological platform on which everything else was built. And horses, like human beings, needed to eat. Specifically, horses needed to eat oats. And oats, being a grain crop grown in exactly the fields that had been failing across Europe throughout 1816 and into 1817, were suddenly, disastrously, in extremely short supply. The oat harvest of 1816 was, across most of the affected regions of Europe, a catastrophe. Prices for oats followed the same trajectory as prices for wheat and rye and barley, doubling and tripling in the space of months. And the practical consequence of this, in the winter of 1816 into 1817, was that horses began to die, not in ones and twos, in enormous numbers. Farmers who could no longer afford to feed their working animals had to make brutal choices. Some sold their horses to knackers for whatever price they could get. Some slaughtered them and ate them, which produced a small revival of interest in horsemeat as a food source across parts of Central Europe that would leave cultural traces for the next century. Some simply turned them loose to fend for themselves, which in a landscape where every scrap of forage was already being consumed by desperate humans amounted to the same thing as killing them. The exact numbers are difficult to establish because horse mortality in this period was not systematically recorded, but the various estimates and contemporary accounts suggest that a significant fraction of the working horse population of Central Europe died between the autumn of 1816 and the spring of 1817. Some accounts place the figure as high as one-third of the horses in certain regions. Others place it lower. But the direction of the trend was universally acknowledged. Horses were dying, and the transportation infrastructure of Europe was under a kind of pressure it had not experienced in living memory. And this pressure produced, in the mind of a particular civil servant working in the forestry department of the Grand Duchy of Baden, an idea. His name was Karl Friedrich Christian Ludwig, Freiherr Dries von Sauerbrunn, and he is generally referred to in the historical literature simply as Karl Dries. He was a minor aristocrat, a trained forester, and a natural inventor with the specific temperament of someone who cannot look at a problem without immediately beginning to sketch out mechanisms that might solve it. He had spent the previous decade tinkering with various mechanical devices, some of them useful, some of them fantastical. He had built a stenographic typewriter. He had built a four-wheeled human-powered cart that he had demonstrated with limited success. He had built various contraptions whose specific functions have been lost to history or which had never quite worked properly in the first place. He was, in the classification of inventors that historians of technology sometimes find useful, a hobbyist rather than a professional, an amateur whose access to the aristocratic circles of Baden gave him the leisure and the resources to pursue his mechanical enthusiasms without ever quite having to make any of them commercially viable. But in the winter of 1816 and into the spring of 1817, Dries found himself thinking hard about the horse problem. Because the horse problem was not just a problem for farmers and for the postal service. It was a problem for civil servants like himself who needed to move around the countryside as part of their official duties. A forester whose horse has died has a problem. He needs to visit stands of timber, inspect trees, communicate with woodsmen working at scattered sites across the ducal forests. And if he cannot get a new horse and cannot afford to feed the horses that are still available, his job becomes extremely difficult. Dries began to think about whether there might be some way of moving a human being across ground at horse-like speeds without needing an actual horse. And the answer he arrived at, after some months of experimentation and design work in the winter and early spring of 1817, was startling. What Dries built, and what he demonstrated in public for the first time on the 12th of June, 1817, on the road between Mannheim and Schwetzingen, was a two-wheeled wooden device that he called the Laufmaschine, which translates roughly as running machine. It consisted of two wheels of roughly equal size, mounted in line one behind the other on a wooden frame, with a seat in the middle where the rider could sit, and a set of handlebars connected to the front wheel that allowed the rider to steer. The rider propelled the machine forward not by pedaling. Pedals had not yet been invented and would not be attached to a two-wheeled vehicle until the 1860s, but by pushing off the ground with his feet, in a kind of striding motion that lifted the machine forward with each stride and allowed the rider, once he had built up some momentum, to lift his feet off the ground entirely and coast for a distance before pushing off again. It was, essentially, a bicycle without pedals, a hobby horse in the English version of the name that would soon attach itself to the device, a Drayson in the name that Dry's own contemporaries began to use in his honor, and its demonstration on that day in June of 1817 represented the first time in human history, so far as we can currently establish, that a human being had propelled himself across ground on a balanced two-wheeled vehicle. The specific insight that made the machine possible, and that Dry's had worked out through his experiments in the preceding months, was the counterintuitive discovery that a two-wheeled vehicle, once it is moving forward at any significant speed, is dynamically stable. It does not fall over. The gyroscopic effect of the spinning wheels and the constant microcorrections that the rider makes with the handlebars combine to keep the machine upright in a way that seems, when you have not seen it before, essentially impossible. Every child who learns to ride a bicycle rediscovers this fact, and every child finds it, in the moment of discovery, slightly miraculous. But Dry's worked it out first. He worked it out through pure experiment, through trial and error, through the process of falling off his machine repeatedly until he discovered the trick of staying on. And once he had worked it out, he built the machine, and he rode it, and he covered the roughly 7 kilometers between Mannheim and Schwetzingen and back again in a time of about an hour, which meant that he was moving on the flat sections at something like the speed of a trotting horse. Without a horse. Without oats, without any of the infrastructure that a horse required. Just a wooden frame, 2 wheels, and a man pushing himself along with his feet. The Laufmaschine was, in the immediate context, a response to a specific crisis. The horses were dying, and Dry's had invented a machine that would let a human being move around without them. He obtained a patent from the Grand Duchy of Baden. He obtained an equivalent patent in France. He demonstrated the machine to various royal and aristocratic audiences across Europe and received a favorable reception. In the first 2 or 3 years after its introduction, the Laufmaschine achieved something of a fashionable vogue among the wealthy young men of London and Paris, who purchased copies of the device for large sums and rode them around parks and pleasure gardens for the amusement of themselves and their friends. There were hobby horse riding schools in London for a brief period. There were satirical prints mocking the young dandies who rode them. There were injuries, complaints from pedestrians whom the riders knocked down, and eventually municipal ordinances in several cities banning the use of the machines on public footways, which was in fact where their wooden wheels worked best because the roads of the period were too rough and uneven for any real speed. By 1820 or 1821, the initial fashion had faded. The horses had recovered, the oat harvests had returned to normal, and the specific crisis that had made Dry's invention seem urgent had passed. The Laufmaschine, for the next 40 years or so, largely disappeared from public use. But it did not disappear from the world, and this is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary in its long-term consequences. Because the fundamental insight that Dry's had worked out, the insight that a human being could propel himself on a balanced two-wheeled vehicle at speeds significantly faster than walking, using only his own muscular power and without any external source of energy. That insight, once it existed, did not unexist. It sat there in the technical repertoire of European inventors for the next 4 decades, waiting to be picked up again. And in the 1860s, a Parisian carriage maker named Pierre Micaux, working with his son Ernest and with his employees, took up Dry's design and added the crucial innovation that had been missing from the original machine. They attached pedals to the front wheel. The rider could now propel himself without touching his feet to the ground, and with the addition of pedals, the two-wheeled vehicle became something quite recognizably related to what we now call a bicycle. The Michalk's velocipede of the 1860s and the various further developments that followed it across the following decades would evolve through the high-wheeled penny farthing of the 1870s, through the chain-driven safety bicycle of the 1880s, through the pneumatic tire of the 1890s, into the mass-produced, mass-distributed, world-transforming machine that would, by the early 20th century, become the primary form of personal transportation for hundreds of millions of people. All of that, all of it, is descended directly from Carl Dreis's Laufmaschine of 1817. And the Laufmaschine of 1817 was, quite directly and quite unambiguously, a response to a horse shortage caused by an oat shortage, caused by a failed harvest, caused by a summer that would not warm, caused by a mountain that had exploded in Indonesia 26 months earlier. The chain of causation here is worth pausing on, because it is one of the strangest examples in the entire history of technology of how a natural disaster on one continent can, through a series of intermediate steps, produce an invention on another continent whose eventual consequences run for centuries. A volcano exploded in 1815. The following summer failed to warm across the northern hemisphere. The oat harvest of 1816 was, in Central Europe, a catastrophe. The horses that depended on oats began to starve. A minor German aristocrat with a hobbyist's interest in mechanical devices decided that the horse shortage constituted a problem worth solving, and worked out that a human being could balance on two wheels moving in a straight line. That insight sat in the technical repertoire of European engineering for 40 years, was eventually picked up and improved with the addition of pedals, evolved through a series of further refinements across the second half of the 19th century, and became the modern bicycle, which by the 20th century was providing personal mobility to more people than any other machine in human history. Every bicycle currently in operation on Earth, every folding commuter bike, and every carbon fiber racing machine, and every rusting three-speed leaning against a garage wall, is descended in a direct genealogical sense from a wooden device that Carl Dreis built and rode down a road in Baden in June of 1817. And Carl Dreis built that device because a volcano nobody at the time understood had turned off the sun. The Laufmaschine is not, of course, the only technological or intellectual consequence of the year without a summer that would echo down through the following centuries. It is simply the most spectacular one, in the sense that it can be traced most cleanly along a single line of causation. There are others. There is a substantial body of research suggesting that the westward migration of New England farmers in the years following 1816 was a significant contributor to the intellectual and religious ferment of what historians of American religion have come to call the Second Great Awakening, and that specific groups, such as the followers of Joseph Smith, who would go on to found the Latter-day Saints movement, were shaped in ways that connect back to the population displacement of these years. Joseph Smith's family, as it happens, was among those who left Vermont for western New York in 1816 and 1817, and Joseph Smith, Jr., the founder of the Mormon Church, spent his formative years in the town of Palmyra, which had become his family's destination after the failure of their Vermont farm in the wake of the volcanic summer. Whether or not you consider the founding of the Latter-day Saints movement to be a consequence of the Tambora eruption is a matter of how much causal weight you are prepared to assign to any single link in a chain that has many links. But it is at least true that the specific human beings who made the specific decisions that shaped American religious history in the middle 19th century were, in significant numbers, people whose life trajectories had been rerouted by what had happened to the sky in the years immediately after 1815. There are more direct scientific consequences, too, though these took much longer to develop. Because one of the strangest and most striking things about the year without a summer, when you look at it from the perspective of the history of science, is how long it took for anyone to work out what had actually happened. The eruption of Tambora took place in April of 1815. The atmospheric consequences unfolded across the following 2 or 3 years and were experienced by essentially the entire population of the Northern Hemisphere. And yet the connection between the volcano and the weather was not seriously proposed by anyone until decades later, and was not scientifically established with any degree of confidence until well into the 20th century. Benjamin Franklin had, as I mentioned earlier, offered some tentative speculations after the Icelandic Laki eruption of 1783, suggesting that the strange dry fog and cold winter that followed that eruption might have been connected to volcanic activity. But Franklin's speculations had not been developed into anything resembling a scientific theory and had been largely forgotten by the time Tambora erupted. When the year without a summer descended on the Northern Hemisphere, the intellectual framework for understanding what was happening simply did not exist, and so people reached for other explanations. Some of the explanations that were offered in the public press and in the private letters of the period are, from a modern perspective, quite bizarre, though they represented perfectly reasonable attempts to make sense of the observable data, given the theoretical resources available at the time. There was a widespread belief, promoted with particular energy in the newspapers of the eastern United States, that the strange weather was somehow being caused by sunspots. Astronomers had noted a significant increase in the number of visible sunspots across 1816 and 1817, and the idea that these dark patches on the sun's surface were somehow blocking or filtering the sun's light and heat before it reached the Earth was one that had a certain intuitive appeal. It was, in the loosest sense, moving in the right direction. The intuition that something was blocking sunlight was correct. It was simply attributing the blockage to the wrong thing. There was another theory, promoted by various natural philosophers of a more speculative bent, that suggested the disruption was being caused by a mysterious dark planet, tentatively named Herschel after the astronomer who had discovered Uranus, whose orbit was periodically bringing it into a position where it interfered with the sun's light. There was a theological interpretation, promoted by various clergymen, that the cold summer represented a form of divine punishment for the moral failings of the age, though there was some disagreement about which moral failings specifically were being punished. There were prophecies. There were predictions that the sun was going to be extinguished entirely and that the end of the world was at hand. In Italy, an astronomer whose predictions were amplified through unreliable channels had apparently announced that the 18th of July, 1816, would be the day on which the sun's fires would go out permanently, and there were reports of communities in various parts of Europe where the population had gathered in churches or in public squares on that date to await the end. When the sun rose and set on the 19th of July in the ordinary manner, or at least in the ordinary manner, as manner had been ordinary that summer, the immediate panic subsided, but the more diffuse sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the world did not go away. The connection between the strange weather and Mount Tambora was, in fact, made by nobody in the immediate aftermath. Nobody in Europe or America made it, because the eruption had barely registered in the Western press. And nobody in the region around Tambora made it either, because the local populations who had experienced the eruption did not have the geographic reach to observe what was happening to the climate on other continents. The two halves of the story existed in complete isolation from each other. The eruption was a local Indonesian catastrophe that had killed tens of thousands of people and had been forgotten by everyone outside the immediate region. The strange weather was a global meteorological phenomenon that nobody could explain, and it would take almost the entire 19th century before the connection between them was even proposed as a serious hypothesis, and considerably longer than that before it was confirmed. The first person to actually propose the connection was, of all people, an American named William Humphreys, working in the early 20th century as a meteorologist at the United States Weather Bureau. In a paper published in 1913, Humphreys argued that volcanic dust in the upper atmosphere could produce measurable cooling of the Earth's surface, and he specifically identified the Tambora eruption of 1815 as the probable cause of the year without a summer of 1816. His argument was based on a comparison of the meteorological records that had been kept in various locations throughout the affected years with what was known about the timing and estimated magnitude of the Tambora eruption, and his conclusion was that the fit was too close to be coincidental. Humphrey's paper was received with interest, but not with immediate consensus. There were other meteorologists who preferred other explanations. There were climatologists who thought the connection was overstated. The scientific establishment of the early 20th century was not yet prepared to accept that a single geological event on one side of the world could produce measurable climate effects on the other side. It would take decades of further research, including the development of ice core sampling techniques that allowed scientists to actually measure the atmospheric sulfate concentrations from specific years in the deep past, before the connection between Tambora and 1816 was placed beyond reasonable scientific doubt. The confirmation came, in the strong form we now have of it, only in the 1960s and 70s, with the first proper ice core studies of the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets. When those studies looked at the ice layers corresponding to 1815 and 1816, they found exactly the concentration of sulfate deposition that a massive volcanic eruption would have produced. The signature of Tambora was written into the ice at both poles. And by comparing the concentrations from Tambora with those from other known eruptions of the historical period, scientists could work out with increasing precision just how enormous the eruption had been, and just how much sulfur it had lofted into the stratosphere, and just how significant its effects on global temperatures should have been. The numbers, when they were finally worked out, matched the historical experience of the year without a summer with a precision that essentially settled the question. Tambora had done it. The mountain nobody had heard of had turned off the sun. The interval between the event and its scientific explanation is, I think, one of the most striking features of the entire story. 150 years. It took 150 years for the human species to work out why, in the summer of 1816, our great-great-grandparents had watched their crops die under snow that fell in June. 150 years, during which the surviving folk memory of the disaster, in New England and in the alpine villages of Switzerland, and in the rural communities of Ireland and China and India, was passed down through diaries and letters and grandparent stories, as a kind of formless legend of a lost summer whose cause nobody could ever quite name. 1800 and froze to death, they called it in Vermont. The poverty year, they called it in Maine. And nobody, in any of those places, ever knew that the cause of it was a mountain called Tambora on the far side of the world, whose name the survivors of the summer would have found unpronounceable if anyone had thought to tell it to them. There is one more strand of the story that deserves a careful telling before we get to the ending, and it is the strand that concerns what actually happened to the specific individuals whose lives had been reshaped by the strange summer of 1816. Because the eruption produced not just population-level consequences, but a series of individual biographies whose subsequent trajectories are, in some cases, worth following in their own right. And the biographies of the people in that villa on Lake Geneva, in particular, are worth following, because they were young and interconnected and famous, and because their subsequent lives would play out against the backdrop of a European century in which the ghosts and monsters they had invented in the summer of 1816 would gradually detach themselves from their creators and become common cultural property, moving outward into the world in ways that none of the people at the Villa Diodati could have anticipated. Byron himself would never return to England. He remained on the continent for the rest of his life, moving between Switzerland and Italy and eventually Greece, producing across the following 8 years the poetry that would consolidate his reputation as one of the great figures of English Romantic literature, and eventually, in a sense he would probably have found gratifying, transform him into a kind of secular saint of the Romantic cause. He completed Childe Harold's pilgrimage. He wrote Manfred and Don Juan, and a series of shorter works whose combined effect on European literary taste was substantial. He became involved in Italian revolutionary politics, contributing money and organizational effort to the Carbonari conspiracy against the Austrian occupation of northern Italy. And in 1823, he committed himself to the cause of Greek independence from the Ottoman Empire, sailing to Greece with a substantial sum of his own money and with the intention of taking direct part in the military campaign against Ottoman forces. He never fired a shot. He contracted a fever in the marshes near the town of Missolonghi in western Greece, and after several weeks of illness and increasingly aggressive medical treatment at the hands of physicians who bled him copiously in the belief that they were helping, he died on the 19th of April, 1824. He was 36 years old. His body was returned to England, though the church refused to permit his burial in Westminster Abbey on grounds of his moral reputation, and he was interred instead in the family vault near his ancestral home in Nottinghamshire. The Greeks, for whose cause he had died, made him a national hero, and he remains one to this day. Percy Bysshe Shelley would follow Byron into an early death by an even shorter interval. He and Mary settled in Italy after the summer at the villa, moving between various towns along the Ligurian coast and the Tuscan interior, and Shelley produced across these years the poetry that constitutes the mature body of his work. Ode to the West Wind, Adonais, Prometheus Unbound, The Mask of Anarchy. The Shelley marriage was, by most accounts, complicated and periodically unhappy. Mary suffered further losses of children, including their daughter Clara in 1818 and their son William in 1819, deaths that damaged her both physically and psychologically in ways that would take years to recover from and that would color the rest of her writing life. Percy formed various emotional attachments to other women during these years, including a particularly intense connection with a young Italian noblewoman named Emilia Viviani that produced the poem Epipsychidion. And on the 8th of July, 1822, sailing a small boat called the Don Juan back to his summer residence at Lerisai after visiting Byron in Pisa, Percy Shelley was caught in a sudden violent squall off the coast of Viareggio. The boat went down. His body washed ashore some days later and was identified by the copy of Keats's poems that was still in his jacket pocket. He was cremated on the beach in a ceremony that Byron and their friend Edward Trelawney arranged in what they took to be the classical manner, and his ashes were interred in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. He was 29 years old. Mary Shelley, having lost her husband and 3 of her 4 children, returned to England with her surviving son Percy Florence in 1823 and lived the remaining 28 years of her life primarily as a professional writer and as the guardian of her dead husband's literary reputation. She never remarried. She continued to write novels, including The Last Man in 1826, a work of apocalyptic science fiction whose reputation has grown considerably in recent decades and which is now recognized as one of the founding texts of the disaster novel as a literary genre. She wrote biographies. She edited her husband's poetry for posthumous publication. She lived through the accession of Queen Victoria in 1837 and the political upheavals of the 1840s. And she watched, across the decades of her later life, as her first novel, Frankenstein, slowly detached itself from her authorship in the public imagination and became instead a common cultural property, adapted for the stage by playwrights she had never met, reprinted in editions whose profits she rarely saw, and gradually transformed into the myth whose modern shape most of us recognize. Mary Shelley died in London in February of 1851 at the age of 53, of what is now generally thought to have been a brain tumor. She was buried, at her request, with the disinterred remains of her mother and her father in the churchyard of St. Peter's in Bournemouth. Percy Florence Shelley, her surviving son, lived on into the 1880s, becoming a moderately successful minor gentleman and preserving his mother's papers with a diligence that has been of enormous value to subsequent scholarship. John Polidori's fate we have already touched on. Having been dismissed by Byron in the autumn of 1816, he returned to England, made a series of unsuccessful attempts to establish himself in medical practice, drifted into gambling and into the associated debts that ruin ambitious young men who cannot afford the losses they incur, and died on the 24th of August, 1821, at his father's house in London. The immediate cause of death was recorded at the time as unspecified, and the coroner's inquest returned a verdict of death by natural causes. But the family's private correspondence and the accounts of those who knew him well strongly suggest that he died by taking prussic acid, which is to say cyanide, in the aftermath of a particularly ruinous gambling loss. He was 25. His niece, born to his sister some years after his death, would grow up to be Christina Rossetti, one of the finest poets of the Victorian era. His nephew would be Dante Gabriel Rossetti, the painter and poet. The Polidori family, in other words, continued to produce artists of genuine distinction across the century after John Polidori's death, and the vampire he had drafted in a rainy villa on Lake Geneva would go on to appear in successive generations of literary reworking, in the works of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu and Bram Stoker and their many descendants, becoming eventually one of the most durable characters in the entire canon of Western horror. Polidori himself, ironically, is now remembered almost exclusively for his connection to that character. The vampire outlived him. The vampire outlived all of them. Claire Claremont's fate was in some ways the strangest and in some ways the saddest of any of the participants in that summer. She gave birth to Byron's daughter Allegra in January of 1817 and lived with the child for the first year and a half of her life, before Byron insisted on taking custody of the girl and placing her in a convent in the Romagna region of Italy, on the grounds that Claire was an unsuitable mother and that Allegra required proper Catholic instruction. Claire objected desperately and repeatedly. She wrote begging letters. She sought the intervention of Percy Shelley and of Mary and of anyone else she could think of who might have influence with Byron. Byron refused to relent, and in April of 1822, Allegra died in the convent at Bagnacavallo of what appears to have been typhus at the age of 5. She was buried in Italy. Claire, who never forgave Byron for what she considered to be his responsibility in the child's death, lived on into extreme old age, moving between Italy and Russia and England and Austria in various positions as a governess and companion, and eventually settling in Florence, where she died in 1879 at the age of 80. She was the last surviving participant in the summer at the Villa Diodati. She outlived Byron by 55 years, and Percy Shelley by 57, and Mary Shelley by 28, and Polidori by 58. When she died, in the reign of Umberto I of Italy, in a Florence that had electric telegraphs and railway stations, and the beginnings of a modern industrial economy, the summer of 1816 had passed almost entirely out of living memory. The novels and the stories and the poems that had emerged from that summer were, by then, established classics of the canon, taught in schools and universities, and adapted for the popular stage. But the specific weather that had made them possible, the specific summer in which they had been drafted, was no longer something that anyone under the age of 80 could actually remember. And what of Carl Dries, the inventor of the running machine, whose Laufmaschine of 1817 would eventually produce the modern bicycle? His subsequent career was, if anything, sadder and more difficult than the immediate story of the Laufmaschine's success would suggest. Dries continued to invent things across the following decades, including improved versions of his stenographic typewriter, a hand-cranked railway inspection car that would eventually become known as a Drayson in a different application of his name, and a variety of other mechanical devices. But he was not, as it turned out, a successful commercial figure. His patents were widely infringed. His inventions were widely imitated without his receiving any royalty payments. He fell into political difficulties in 1848 when he became involved in the liberal revolutionary movements that swept across the German states in that year, and the failure of those revolutions left him with a reputation in conservative circles that damaged his subsequent professional prospects. He renounced his aristocratic title, which had by that point become a political liability. He was harassed by former political enemies. His pension was reduced. His financial situation deteriorated, and he died in Karlsruhe on the 10th of December, 1851, at the age of 66, in essentially reduced circumstances. His grave, when it was located by cycling enthusiasts in the late 19th century, was found to be in a neglected condition. The inventor of the bicycle had died forgotten and poor. The sky began to clear across the course of 1818. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, in the way that atmospheric phenomena tend to shift when the underlying causes are being slowly diluted rather than sharply removed. The volcanic aerosols that Tambora had lofted into the stratosphere had been settling out throughout 1817 and into the following year, drifting down through the upper atmosphere and eventually being scavenged out by rainfall and by the ordinary processes of atmospheric cleansing. By the summer of 1818, the sunsets across northern Europe had begun to return to something closer to their normal appearance. The lurid reds and vermilions that Turner had been painting for 3 years faded back into the ordinary golds and pinks of an ordinary evening sky. The sun, when it appeared with something like its ordinary strength. Farmers who planted their crops that spring found that the crops actually grew. Harvests were, if not immediately abundant, at least survivable. Grain prices began to fall from the extraordinary peaks they had reached in 1817. The famine mortality that had been running at catastrophic levels across parts of Ireland and Central Europe subsided. The cholera pandemic that had begun in Bengal continued to spread and would continue to spread for decades in a pattern of successive waves that would reshape global public health policy across the entire 19th century. But the specific meteorological anomaly that had triggered its initial appearance had passed. The year without a summer was over. The years without a summer were over. The world, in the specific atmospheric sense, was returning to normal. And what happened next, what happened in the immediate aftermath of the disaster's ending, is in some ways the most striking part of the entire story. Because what happened next was, essentially, forgetting. Not immediate forgetting, not comprehensive forgetting. The people who had lived through 1816 remembered it, and they told their children about it. And the folk memory of the disaster persisted in the affected communities for at least a generation, and in some cases 2 or 3 generations. But the connection between the strange summer and the volcano that had caused it was never made, because it could not be made with the intellectual resources available at the time. And so the memory of the disaster gradually detached itself from any explanatory framework. It became a kind of unaccountable strangeness in the historical record. A year when the crops had failed and nobody quite knew why. A period of darkness that had descended and then lifted for reasons that no one could specify. In the memory of New England, it became 1800 and froze to death. And in the memory of Ireland and Britain, it became the wet summer of 1816. And in the memory of Switzerland and southern Germany, it became the hunger year, the Hunjajar. And in the memory of China and India, it took different forms in different regional traditions. In none of these places did anyone know that all of these separate regional catastrophes had been aspects of a single event whose cause was located on an obscure island in the Dutch East Indies. The disaster fragmented in the memory. It became many small local disasters instead of the one enormous global one that it had actually been. And the mountain that had caused it, the mountain called Tambora, receded even further into obscurity than it had been in before 1815. It went back to being an island volcano that no one outside the immediate region knew about. It resumed its geological rest, more or less, with only occasional minor emissions across the following 2 centuries. And it waited, in a sense, for the people who would eventually, 150 years later, come and read its story out of the ash layers and the ice cores and the historical meteorological records and understand what had happened. The literary and cultural products of the disaster, meanwhile, embarked on their own trajectories, largely detached from any memory of the atmospheric conditions that had produced them. Frankenstein was published in January of 1818 and was greeted with a critical reception that was mixed, but that included some strikingly perceptive readings, particularly from the reviewer in Blackwood's magazine, who identified the novel as a work of genuine philosophical seriousness, whose implications extended well beyond the boundaries of the ordinary Gothic tale. The novel was widely reprinted across the following decades. It was dramatized for the stage as early as 1823 in a production at the English Opera House in London, and the theatrical adaptations quickly acquired a life of their own, drifting away from the specific concerns of Mary Shelley's text and toward the visual spectacle that the story could provide. It was in these early theatrical adaptations, rather than in the novel itself, that many of the elements that we now associate with the Frankenstein myth first appeared. The creature became less articulate on the stage than he had been in the book, because a novel can give a monster a philosophical vocabulary that an actor speaking in front of an audience in a theater of the 1820s would have found impossible to sustain. The specific scientific speculation that Mary Shelley had built into the novel, the connection to galvanism and to the experiments of the period, dropped out of the popular understanding of the story and was replaced by a vaguer general association with lightning and electricity. The creature acquired, through successive adaptations, various visual features that the novel had not specified. He became green in the 20th century, though there is nothing in Mary Shelley's text to justify that particular choice. He acquired bolts in his neck through the Universal Studios adaptation of 1931, a design decision by the makeup artist Jack Pierce that was based on a rough interpretation of what Victor Frankenstein might have needed to conduct electrical current through his creation's body. He acquired the flat-topped head from the same production. He acquired, through a process of gradual cultural drift, the name Frankenstein itself, which in the novel had belonged to the creator rather than to the creature, but which by the mid-20th century had become firmly attached to the monster in the popular imagination, to the point where the confusion is now essentially uncorrectable. What had begun as an 18-year-old woman's philosophical meditation on the ethics of creation, written in a rainy villa on Lake Geneva in the shadow of a volcanic eruption that no one at the time understood, had become a cultural property so vast and so widely distributed that its original author's specific concerns had been largely dissolved in the current of successive reinterpretation. Frankenstein is now, in a fundamental sense, everyone's story and no one's story, and Mary Shelley's specific authorship of it, while never denied, has become in a strange way peripheral to the myth she created. The Vampire followed a similar trajectory. Polidori's novella, published under Byron's name in 1819 and then reattributed to Polidori after various denials and clarifications, was widely translated and widely read across Europe. It went through numerous editions across the following decades. It was adapted for the stage. It influenced a generation of Gothic writers, most notably Sheridan Le Fanu, whose novella Carmilla in 1872 would explore the vampire theme in a specifically feminine register that Polidori had not attempted. And in 1897, Bram Stoker's Dracula, drawing on the entire tradition that Polidori had inaugurated, would produce the definitive 19th century version of the aristocratic vampire and would make the character so iconic that Polidori's original Lord Ruthven would be almost entirely eclipsed. Almost every subsequent development in vampire fiction, and by extension in vampire film, would trace back through Dracula to Polidori, and behind Polidori to Byron's abandoned fragment and the ghost story competition at the Villa Diodati. But by the time the 20th century film industry began producing the vampire movies that would establish the character as a fixture of popular culture, essentially no one who watched those films had any idea that the tradition had originated in a specific rainy summer in 1816 at a specific villa on Lake Geneva as a response to a volcanic eruption on a specific Indonesian island. The chain of causation had become invisible. The vampire was simply a cultural fact. It was part of the furniture of Western imagination. It had detached itself from its origins and had become itself. The bicycle, similarly, achieved a kind of cultural universality across the late 19th and 20th centuries that entirely obscured its origins. The Michalk's velocipede of the 1860s had barely acknowledged its debt to Dries. The high-wheeled ordinaries of the 1870s and the safety bicycles of the 1880s had further obscured the connection. By the time the modern chain-driven pneumatic-tired bicycle had emerged as the standard form of the machine in the 1890s, Carl Dries was essentially unknown outside of a small group of German technical historians. His Laufmaschine had been recognized, in retrospect, as the ancestor of the modern bicycle, but the specific circumstances that had produced it, the horse famine, the failed oat harvest, the atmospheric consequences of the Tambora eruption, had entirely dropped out of the story. The bicycle became a symbol of modernity, of personal freedom, of the industrial and technological progress of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It became, in the years around the turn of the 20th century, a particularly important symbol of women's independence, as the safety bicycle allowed middle-class women of the 1890s a degree of personal mobility that had been essentially unavailable to their mothers. It became a machine of political and cultural significance in ways that no one riding one thought about in any specific historical terms. And behind all of it, unremembered and unnamed, was the fact that the whole thing had begun because a mountain had exploded and horses had starved. The pattern here, and I think this is the pattern that the whole story of the year without a summer ultimately illustrates, is a pattern that recurs in the history of very large-scale disasters and their consequences. The immediate effects of the disaster are visible and dramatic and are recorded in detail. The medium-term effects, the political and social and economic consequences, are also generally recorded, though with less clarity and with a growing tendency to lose sight of the original causes. And then the long-term effects, the effects that unfold over generations and centuries, are almost invariably detached in the popular memory from the original event, and are experienced by subsequent generations as simply features of the world that have always been there. Frankenstein has always been a myth. Vampires have always been aristocrats. Bicycles have always been part of the modern world. The eruption that lay behind all of this receded so completely into the background of history that most educated people today, if you ask them about the origins of the modern horror novel or the modern bicycle, would not think to mention a volcanic eruption in the Dutch East Indies as a relevant factor. And yet the connection is real and traceable, and in some cases direct enough that one can follow it link by link from the mountain to the artifact, provided one has the patience and the sources to follow it. There is one final piece of the story that I want to spend some time on, because it has become genuinely important in ways that the people who lived through 1816 could not have anticipated. And it is the question of what the year without a summer means for us now, in a century whose relationship to climate is very different from anything the 19th century had to contemplate, and in a moment when the possibility that human beings might ourselves deliberately load the stratosphere with sulfur aerosols in order to cool the planet is something that serious scientists in serious research programs are actually studying. Because that possibility exists. It has a name. It is called stratospheric aerosol injection, sometimes referred to more generally as solar radiation management or solar geoengineering, and it is one of the more prominent proposals currently under discussion in the climate policy debates of the 21st century. And the technical proposal is, in essence, this. If the Earth is warming because of increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and if the political and economic difficulties of reducing those emissions are proving to be intractable, then perhaps we might consider deliberately injecting large quantities of sulfur or other reflective materials into the stratosphere in order to increase the amount of sunlight reflected back into space, thereby cooling the planet artificially and offsetting some of the warming that human activity has already caused. The proposal is controversial. The proposal is deeply contested by climate scientists and by policymakers and by ethicists and by essentially everyone who has thought seriously about its implications. But it exists, and it is being studied, and the reason we know that it might, in principle, work at all is because we know what happened to the global climate after Mount Tambora exploded in 1815. Tambora is, in an important sense, the primary natural experiment we have for understanding what happens when the stratosphere is heavily loaded with sulfur aerosols. It is the most extreme case in the modern historical record for which we have both good climate data and reasonable estimates of the initial forcing. The eruption of Pinatubo in 1991 is a smaller and more recent case and provided a great deal of additional data, but Tambora remains the reference event. And the specific way that Tambora affected the climate, the specific pattern of cooling and precipitation change and agricultural failure that unfolded in the years after 1815, is the specific pattern that scientists studying the possible consequences of deliberate stratospheric aerosol injection have to grapple with. Because what the year without a summer teaches us, if it teaches us anything, is that turning down the sun is not a simple operation. It does not just reduce global temperatures in a smooth and predictable way. It affects rainfall patterns. It disrupts monsoons. It changes the distribution of temperature across latitudes. It hits some regions much harder than others, and the regions it hits hardest are frequently the regions that were already the most vulnerable to begin with. The monsoon failures that Tambora produced in India and in China killed more people, in all probability, than the cold summers in New England and Europe. The famines and epidemics that followed in the wake of the eruption disproportionately affected the poorest populations of the affected regions. And if a policy of deliberate stratospheric aerosol injection were ever implemented on the scale that would be necessary to counteract global warming, the specific distribution of its effects would need to be understood in enormous detail, because a policy that cooled the planet as a whole while destroying the monsoon in India would not be a policy that most reasonable people would want to see implemented. All of these considerations, all of these questions, are being investigated today with reference back to Tambora and to the year of cold summers that followed it. The event that no one could explain at the time, that took 150 years to be scientifically understood, is now serving as one of the primary data points in a debate about how humanity ought to intervene in the climate system in the coming century. The year without a summer has become, in a sense that nobody living in it could have anticipated, prospectively relevant. The past that no one could explain is now the past that we are using to think about the future. And this brings me, at last, to what I think is the deepest and most peculiar feature of the whole story, which is that the eruption of Tambora and the year of failed summers that followed it was a genuinely catastrophic event whose consequences reshaped the world in ways that persist to this day. And it was an event that was, at the time, essentially invisible to the people it was affecting. They saw the effects. They saw the cold summers, the failed harvests, the strange skis, but they did not see the cause. The cause was located in a part of the world that was, to them, essentially off the map. The cause was written in a scientific language that had not yet been invented. The cause was hidden in plain sight, in the ash layers being deposited in the polar ice caps that no one would think to look at for another century and a half. And so the people of 1816 and 1817 and 1818 lived through the largest volcanic climate event of the past several thousand years without knowing that they were doing so. They experienced its consequences as a kind of unexplained bad luck, as an inexplicable dark passage in their collective history, as something whose meaning was withheld from them by the specific limits of what could be known at the time. They wrote novels about it, or rather, they wrote novels while it was happening, without knowing that the atmosphere in which those novels were being written was part of the story the novels were telling. They built bicycles in response to it, without knowing that the horse famine that had driven them to invent the bicycle was itself a consequence of an eruption on the other side of the world. They migrated across continents in response to it. They rioted in the streets over grain prices in response to it. They died of typhus and of cholera and of malnutrition in response to it, and they never knew. There is something both humbling and, in a strange way, moving about the recognition that the people of that period lived through what was, in retrospect, one of the defining events of the entire 19th century, and that they lived through it in a state of essentially complete ignorance about what was happening to them. Because it forces us to ask what we ourselves are currently living through in a similar state of ignorance. What events unfolding in our own lives, what conditions we take for granted, what political or economic or environmental facts we experience as ordinary features of the world, are in fact the visible surface of some deeper cause that we simply do not yet have the framework to understand. 200 years from now, when the historians of the late 23rd century are looking back at the early 21st, what will they see as the equivalent of Tambora? What quiet, unrecorded event will they identify as the primary cause of some large-scale historical development that we are currently interpreting, in our own limited terms, as a set of unrelated coincidences? These questions have no obvious answer, and that is exactly the point. The people of 1816 could not have answered similar questions about their own moment either. They were simply in it. They were simply living, as best they could, through consequences they could not see and causes they could not name. The mountain still stands, incidentally, on the northern peninsula of the island of Sumbawa, in what is now the Republic of Indonesia. Its summit is about a mile lower than it was before 1815. Its crater, the enormous caldera that was left behind after the eruption, is about 6 kilometers across and about a kilometer deep, and it is regarded as one of the more spectacular geological features of the entire archipelago. There is a small tourist infrastructure. Climbers ascend the mountain, camp on the rim of the caldera, and descend into it to examine the ash layers that the eruption itself deposited on the surrounding landscape. Volcanologists monitor the mountain continuously. It has shown some minor signs of activity across the past 2 centuries, including some small emissions in the 1880s and again in the 1960s, but nothing that has come remotely close to 1815. Whether it will erupt on that scale again, and when, and what the consequences of such an eruption would be for a global civilization far more interconnected and far more dependent on stable climate patterns than the civilization of the early 19th century are questions that occupy a certain amount of professional attention among the people whose job it is to think about these things. The general consensus is that a repeat of Tambora on the current Earth would be, to put it as neutrally as possible, extremely bad. The specific consequences would depend on the season of the eruption and on the atmospheric circulation patterns at the time, but the effects on global agriculture, on food distribution networks, on the political stability of countries whose populations depend on reliable harvests, on essentially every aspect of modern life that has been built on the assumption of stable climatic conditions, will be difficult to overstate. We are, in this sense, still living in the shadow of what Tambora did, and in the anticipation of what it might, someday, do again. The year without a summer, in the end, is a story about the strangeness of causation. It is a story about how the largest events in human history can sometimes have origins that no one at the time recognizes. It is a story about how a rainy summer on a Swiss lake produced 2 of the enduring monsters of Western literature. It is a story about how a shortage of oats in Germany produced the ancestor of the bicycle. It is a story about how tens of thousands of people in Indonesia died in a matter of hours, and how the ash from their deaths circled the earth and made a New England farmer curse a June frost, and made an 18-year-old woman dream of a corpse coming to life, and made an aspiring inventor sketch 2 wheels on a piece of paper. All of it is one story. And the fact that no one at the time could see it as one story is, perhaps, the most important thing about it. The world was doing something enormous, and the people in it were living through the consequences without any way of knowing that they were the same consequences, or that they had a single cause, or that the cause was named Tambora and stood on an island most of them had never heard of. Thank you so much for listening. I have really enjoyed doing this one. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, drop a comment, share it with someone who might appreciate it, and hit that subscribe button if you have not already. It really does help push us out in the algorithm, and I will see you whenever the sky clears enough for the next one. Good night. Peace.